evening from the News Radio 1120 and 93.7 FM KPNW studios. I'm Bill London, and I'm here to talk about your car's extended warranty. Tonight's crazy Oregon news brought to you by none other than Sean Sutherland. Who is Sean Sutherland? Okay, well, he owns Ask Insurance, so if you have questions about your insurance and we're at enrollment time, now would be a good time to call Sean and just say, yo, I don't understand. I have questions. And he will do his best to answer them for you. And by the way, I co-host the morning show here on KPNW. We call it the Wake Up Call. You can just call it, that sock hop dance party thing that they do on that station every morning. We stream live, by the way, at kpnw.com. Live every morning. So if you like the news here, it's even more concentrated weekdays. All right, let's take a look at crazy Oregon news. We'll start with this just coming in today. An illegal immigrant convicted of sex crimes in our sanctuary state, Utopia, Oregon, held various advisory positions on state policy-making committees as a so-called Latinx community member. Juan Pablo Villalobos Garcia is a criminally convicted Venezuelan national who had well overstayed his visa, according to U.S. immigration authorities, and served in several committee roles advising the state of Oregon on policy areas such as behavioral health, health equity, and health care for all, regardless of immigration status. Before the U.S. Department of Homeland Security nabbed Garcia, he was a Portland area activist and a so-called educator. He was on Oregon's Community Engagement and Communications Committee to the Universal Health Plan Governance Board, which is tasked with creating a comprehensive plan for financing and administering a single-payer health care system here in the state that covers all Oregonians, no matter the immigration status. Garcia's committee is also responsible for developing community outreach recommendations and informational material as part of the Universal Health Plan that the board would present directly to Governor Tina Kotek and the Oregon legislature. On the government website, the board's Community Engagement Committee describes Garcia as, quote, the executive director of Latinx Recovery Center, who is, quote, currently in recovery from substance abuse with a criminal justice history. Garcia, whose record includes sexual abuse, was also an active member of the Behavioral Health Crisis System Advisory Committee, which advises the Oregon Health Authority, which is the state's health department, on overseeing a statewide crisis response system. In 2020, Garcia was convicted of 3 counts of sex abuse, bestiality, and 2 years later for failing to register as a sex offender. In an Instagram post last week, Garcia's organization, Latinx Recovery, said he was abducted by ICE without a warrant. All right, following up on a story that we have been talking about over the past few weeks, a Jackson County District Attorney, Patrick Green, has now filed a contempt action in that county circuit court against the Oregon Department of Corrections for the early release of a convicted sex offender, Joaquin Cowart. Now, this is going back to a story we've told you about the DOC and, well, shall we say, their new math. Cowart was sentenced in Jackson County to a combined 144-month prison term in 2023 and was supposed to stay in prison until about 2030 for repeatedly sexually abusing, let's call it what it was, rape of a 14-year-old girl. And he was one of nearly 400 prisoners whose sentences were recalculated in recent weeks, resulting in reduced sentences, and many of them were just released from prison immediately. Now, the recalculations were prompted by what was considered to be an innocuous Oregon Supreme Court decision in July in the case of Torres Lopez versus Farion, which allowed for credit for time served. Okay. On consecutive sentences. Okay. Well, Green said that the DOC quadruple counted time served credit across consecutive counts, contrary to the court's intent of applying the credit in cases involving concurrent sentences. And he sounded the alarm, as we've reported, in early October about what he refers to as the DOC's misinterpretation of the Supreme Court ruling. Green says the contempt action calls for accountability from the Department of Corrections for prisoners released in error and calls for the agency to appear in court and show cause, quote, why it should not be held in contempt for willfully disregarding the clear intent of a sentencing judgment by unlawfully granting early release of Joaquin Cowart. Now, the DA's office says that the judge, by imposing 4 consecutive 36-month sentences, the sentencing court's clear intent was that a total sentence be 144 months with release intended for 2030, not backdated to 2021. Green called the DOC's resentencing of Cowart absurd and said the agency essentially turned a 144-month consecutive sentence for a dangerous sex offender into a credit for time served sentence, making it appear as though Cowart should have been released immediately after sentencing. The declaration further notes the DOC's actions were taken without consulting the court or prosecutors, and in a clear disregard of the judgment's clear language and intent. Green said the actions of the DOC help facilitate what amounts to a statewide jailbreak, unlawfully and unilaterally releasing dangerous offenders like Cowart, who, by the way, before this particular sentence was already a registered sex offender. And he's being released years before the court's intended or ordered. So what happened here, and kind of putting the case together for you, Cowart did, a little over 3.5 years in jail awaiting trial for his case. And so typically, out of that 12-year sentence, he would be given or allowed 3.5 years for time already served. Well, what the Department of Justice did was take a little over 3 years of county jail time and applied it to each one of the 4 counts, each one being 3 years each. In other words, no time to basically serve. So they're applying that 3 years to the entire 3 years of each one of those 4 sentences and 4 counts that he was found guilty of. Well, tomorrow, Oregon is going to be going in front of the U.S. Supreme Court to argue against some of President Donald Trump's tariffs. The lawsuit was originally filed by Oregon and 11 other states in the U.S. Court of International Trade on April 23rd, and they won that case. And it went before the U.S. Court of Appeals. And both of them ruled in Oregon's favor, saying the tariffs exceed President Trump's authority. Now it's been consolidated. So if the court were to rule in Oregon's favor, that would be the Supreme Court, the Trump administration would have to refund about $90 billion in tariff revenue. The tariffs have been a key piece of Trump's second term, and removing them, according to the administration's brief, would, quote, have catastrophic consequences for our national security, foreign policy, and economy. Now, the crux of the case going before the court is what's known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Now, that law went into effect in 1977 here in the U.S., and it says the president can impose economic regulations in response to, quote, any unusual and extraordinary threat. And it actually has been used previously to put sanctions on other foreign powers. Now, the courts so far have ruled that the IEEPA doesn't grant Trump the power to issue tariffs. Now, Trump declared an emergency and issued the tariffs to hold, according to the court filings, Mexico, Canada, and China accountable to their promises of halting illegal immigration and stopping poisonous fentanyl and other drugs from coming into the country. In April, Trump also issued a reciprocal tariff, actually tariffs, on most countries, arguing that trade deficits constituted a national emergency under the IEEPA. Well, the deployment of National Guard troops in Portland remains on hold. Judge Karen Immigrant issued a preliminary injunction Sunday night, hours before a temporary restraining order was due to expire. Now, that decision came after a 3-day trial that occurred last week when lawyers for the Trump administration argued troops are needed to allow federal agents to do their jobs at Portland's ICE building. Attorneys for the city and the state claim local and federal law enforcement have kept ongoing protests in check by making numerous arrests. Now, this injunction expires this coming Friday at 5 p.m. to allow Judge Immigrant time to issue a final decision. Oregon Transportation Commissioners voted 3-1 to approve nearly $2 billion for the interstate bridge replacement project spanning the Columbia River connecting Portland and Vancouver. That would be Vancouver, Washington. The lone no vote came from Commissioner Jeff Baker. And he said he couldn't vote to allocate funding, saying, and I'll quote him, "I can't support the request based on wrong information that we all know is wrong." And his reason behind that statement is because, well, the interstate bridge replacement cost estimates are almost 4 years out of date. Now, the cost project was estimated at between $5 and $7.5 billion back in early 2022. The new estimate is expected in December, and it's expected to be considerably higher. But what the heck, numbers don't count. It's Oregon. Speaking of Oregon, the Oregon Department of Justice and the Secretary of State's office have quietly shelved an investigation into 3 individuals suspected of voting, despite the fact they're not U.S. citizens, after an attorney for the state warned the cases were vulnerable due to potential claims of selective prosecution. Isn't pretty much all prosecution selective? Hey, you committed a crime. We select you to go to court and potentially jail. Anyway, the investigation stems from last fall's discovery that more than 1,600 people had been wrongly registered to vote because they weren't citizens while obtaining or renewing driver's licenses or state-issued ID cards. Now, Oregon has automatically registered voters since 2016 when they provide documents proving citizenship during interactions at the DMV. But since 2019, the state's allowed people to obtain driver's licenses without proving they're citizens or even legal residents. A series of errors actually led to the discovery that more than 1,600 people were registered to vote, even though they shouldn't have been. The Secretary of State's office in February referred 3 cases for criminal investigation to the Oregon Department of Justice. And, well, other than saying they aren't prosecuting, they are saying no comment about these investigations. Well, that's because, well, breaking of the law is okay as long as whoever is prosecuting them isn't told that they're being selective. Oregon is now considered one of the worst places to find a job. We're 46th. We're 46th. That, in a comparison of all 50 states, Oregon came in 46th place on WalletHub's list of best states to find a job. Oregon came in dead last for economic environment rank, and we ranked 49th for work-related stress. And finally, the city of Portland is actually going to enforce its ban on homeless camping. It paused it in February because they didn't have enough shelter space. More than 1,000 additional shelter beds were announced last year, and the mayor there is setting a goal of adding 1,500 beds by December. So the homeless campers, if they're found out on the streets or in parks or wherever, will be directed to services in shelter beds because there's plenty of them. So, according to Mayor Wilson, he doesn't expect a sharp increase in the number of citations. That logic, though, assumes that people actually are going to agree to go to a shelter bed in lieu of a citation, which they won't pay anyway. As has been extensively documented, many people living on the streets don't want to move into shelters, in particular congregate shelters, which constitute nearly all of Portland's new shelter beds. So the question is, will they enforce the law? Time will tell. All right, your Crazy Oregon News brought to you by Sean Sutherland. You got questions about your insurance now that, well, it's time to sign up? You better give Sean a call. He'll answer your questions. All right, Rick, time for you to get real.